Good morning and welcome to N=29 in the series of videos about MvvmCross. It's a bit overcast in here in London, but it's summer at least, and we're still in the peak light time. So today's video is about testing. And I'm sorry I haven't covered testing before, really, because testing is one of the big key advantages of using MvvM and using this kind of shared code approach that we do in MvvmCross. So really I should have covered it a lot more by now. However, today I'm going to dive into it a bit, and what I'd like to in particular point you at as another reference is Greg's session from Evolve. So Greg Shackles, G Shackles on Twitter. And he spent 45 minutes there going through some of the strategies you can use for unit testing and integration testing, and even going up to UI testing using things like Xamarin's new test cloud. And it's well worth looking at his talk and seeing, how somebody who's a bit more experienced than me and a bit better practitioner of testing really uses it in practice to really deliver the maximum benefit. So I'll include a link to this talk in the blog post, and it's just worth pointing out that that's there as a resource. There are other pages around, obviously, about various testing frameworks and mocking frameworks and other techniques, but this is a good place to start. So let's dive into code. And what we're going to do is I just want to write some tests around some tip calc type thing. So let's call this tip calc test. And obviously we're going to start here with a portable class library, as we do with almost all of our projects. So let's go to portable class library. And that should just build. Obviously we need to get hold of Windows Phone 7.5, Mono Touch and Mono Android. Let's delete the default class. Let's add our packages for MvvmCross. Let's add them in. And then let's build up a little bit of an application. So what we'll do is I'll add some services, add a new folder called services, and I'll add a class in there. And this is going to be iTip service. Let's add the interface first. Okay, so that's going to build us this, and we will build a public iTip service. And all we want in there is a double that gets returned from a calc method. Just takes a double input. So this first one is the subtotal, total that happens before the total that happens before we add the tip, and then the second thing we want is this generosity. If you remember back, I think it was N=1 even, or maybe something like that, where we last visited this topic of tip calc, and you can see here is a tip service. So let's also just add a implementation for that. Obviously it's quite a trivial implementation, the first one we're going to add, but your app might have a better one. So tip service, iTip service. And this might be really important to your business, how you implement this, because this might be your your banking app or your secret sauce for your expenses app or something. So this could really be very important business logic here. So that's why I'm going to test it. So let's just do this simply here as taking the generosity as percentage and implementing that there. So I'll put that in its own file just for neatness. And then in the view models, we'd like to use that tip service. So I'll get rid of everything that's in this view model to start with. And you can see that brings it down to the fact that it's a view model and it inherits from MVX view model. And then what we'd like to do is we'd like to add a instance of that tip service. So let's add it. And that's _ tip service. And we would like to get that injected for us at runtime using the dependency injection. So that's cool. And then what we'd like to do is add the fields on for the UI. So these are the properties that are going to be used. So the first one of these is a double, which is going to be the subtotal. And we know that whenever the subtotal changes, we would like to update the UI. So we will add an update method as well. And then we would like to also add this, We would also like to add a field for this generosity. So let's add that, which is going to be an int underscore generosity. Oops. No matter how slowly I say it, I can still get it wrong. Generosity. And again with this, whenever the generosity changes, we would like the UI to update, which is this update method here. And what we'd like update to do is we would like update whenever those two things happen and update gets called. We would like the update method to call the tip service and to calculate the generosity, the output tip, and it was going to do that using the subtotal and using the current value of generosity, and it's going to have to store that somewhere. So let's store it in a tip field. Oops. Tip. So that's where it's going to do, and obviously we then need to generate tips, so let's just do that as well. PMVX, and this is going to be a double, and underscore tip, and tip. So that should hopefully, be our entire view model and our entire service written. And what we'd now like to do is test it. So let's first of all just check it builds. It does. And then let's add a test project for it. So the type of project I'm going to use for testing here is a normal Windows class library. And I'm going to call this tipcalctests.tests. And the reason I'm using Windows class library is just because it's easy, because I can run it straight away within Visual Studio using ReSharper, which is what I'll do here. I am using .NET Framework 4.5. The reason for that is just because we're using a portable class library framework, this 104 profile, that requires 4.5 and above. Hopefully that might change in the future, but right now that's where we are. So you can't go back to Windows XP. And that's it. So I'm going to hit OK, and that should build it. And the first thing I'll do is add a reference to the core, because we want to use the core in our testing, because it's what we're going to test. And then the second thing I want to do is pull in some NuGet packages. So the first one I'm going to pull in is NUnit. And NUnit is my preferred testing framework in terms of having tools, because it's so portable. There are others available. There's obviously MSUnit, XUnit, and various other things. But this is the one that I like to use. So I'm going to pull it in. I also like to use a mocking framework, and I'll show you how a mocking framework is used soon. And the mocking framework I like to use is Mock, M-O-Q, so I'm going to pull that in. Others are available, RhinoMox, etc., AutoMock, etc. But this is the one I'm going to use. And then the final thing I want to pull in is I want to pull in this, there's a MvvmCross test helper package, so let's just get hold of it. Here it is. And if you select that one and pull it in, then it pulls it in. And that just gives us some helper classes that I'll show you used shortly. Send mum her harvester voucher. Okay, I know what that's about. Apologies for that showing up on the screen. What I now need to do is actually write some tests. So I'm going to do that. And the first thing I'm going to do is write a test fixture. For those of you familiar with NUnit, you'll know exactly what I'm doing. For those of you who aren't, hopefully you'll get the gist of what to do. And there are plenty of good tutorials around about NUnit, etc. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. There are other places that are really good to start for these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something for tip service tests to start with. So let's just check our tip service works, because this is where our business logic is, and this is where we really would like to do it. So let's create a first test, and what we're going to create is public void test that zero generosity returns 0. Yeah. Returns 0 tip. Yeah, so if you're not feeling at all generous, you don't do that. And for writing every test here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow a pattern which is called AAA. And what this pattern is that you set it up with an arrange to start with. So arrange is where you set up your basic platform, if you like, for your current tests. Then you act, which is actually doing something. And then finally you assert, which is checking that the action had the expected result. So to arrange here, what I'm going to do is just create a tip service. So tip equals new tip service. Tip service and I'm fighting the IntelliSense. And then what I'd like to do is act. So my test here is that the 0 generosity returns 0 tip. So let's do this. Tip calc, and let's do 42.35 is my subtotal, and then my generosity is 0. And then my assertion is just assert r equal 0, result. And that's my first test written. I should be able to run it by right-clicking on it and using resharp as run unit test. Let's see, it's running here in this window, and hopefully you can see here it's run and it's successful, which is what we expect. You know, had I put in 1 here, obviously it would fail. I'm sure you'll see examples of failing tests as I go through. If I run these unit tests now, you get a failure, and it tells you that this one failed because it expected 0 but got 0. We expected 1 but got 0 back. So that's a good first test. We would obviously put other tests in here. So for example, you might put in a test saying that assert that 10 generosity returns a 10% tip, perhaps for this particular one. So if we pass in 10 here, then you get a 4.235 tip. Let's just check that that runs. If we run it up, and you can see, you know, that we can run all our tests. There are tools around like N+1 which will allow you continuously run tests. You can integrate this into your builds that these guys run, and that's the sort of thing you might want to put onto your core business logic to use it. Okay, so that's the tip service. Let's say we've tested that now. Next up, we'd like to test our view model as well, because we've got this view model and it would be nice to test it. So let me just rename this file to match. And let's add another test fixture. So here we go. We're going to add another test fixture. And this one is going to be called the first view model test. Now what we're going to do here is I'm first of all going to write some tests that just fail. Because, and I'll explain why they yeah, I'm going to write some tests that just fail, and then I'll explain why they fail. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a test for our view model, and this is going to be public void test that when we check, so the view model, just to remind ourselves, had a method called property called subtotal, and a property called generosity, and a property called tip. So let's just write a test that says that when subtotal changes, then tip is recalculated. So to do this, again, we're going to follow this AAA pattern. So arrange, act, assert. So the first thing we'd like to arrange here is to do a new tip service, a new first view model. So let's just do that. So first view model equals new first view model. Now the problem we're going to get here is that first view model expects as a parameter an iTip service. So we could, if we wanted to, new up one of these concrete tip services and pass it in. But that would be a bit poor for testing, because let's say tip service is a bit more complicated than we've got, and it's, you know, hundreds of classes or whatever, and it's got dependencies on the network, then it would be very hard to test the view model in isolation. So instead of that, what we do is we use a mock, and as I said, we pulled in this mocking framework. So let's called mock, and that's what we're going to use. So let's just do that. So mock tip service. What we're going to do is we're going to call new mock, and we're going to ask for a mock tip service. Obviously resharp is going to have some work to do here, pulling in these namespaces. And once we've done that, we can then get hold of the object inside this mock tip service, this kind of dynamically created object. You know, it's actually a runtime compile, and that will allow us to actually get hold of a mock for that thing. Okay, so it's also saying that we've got some, we need to reference an additional assembly to do that. And what we'll need to do there is we'll need to actually just let resharper do that for us, and it will pull in the right one. So let's pull it in. Possibly we should add another package for that, but for now I'm just going to, you know, into the NuGet stream. But for now I'm going to leave that as is. So possibly that might change in the future. And what we then get is that, you know, we could move on to act, What we'd also like to do is just configure this mock a little bit more. So the way you configure your mock is there's a setup method. There are other things here as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a setup that says, please, whenever my tip service, this mock, gets called, and it gets called on this calc method, then if it gets called with any double as its first parameter, and if it gets called with any int as its second parameter, then what I'd like you to do, please, I'd like you to return the value, and let's use the value 42. Yeah, so all that's doing is saying when you build up this kind of compiled object, this just-in-time assembly for iTip service, when you build that up, if you get called with any double and any int on the calc, just return 42 regardless. And once you've done that, what you can then do is you can actually act on the view model. So let's just do this. We're going to do a first view model dot, and we're going to set the subtotal, and we'll set that equal to 12 or something. And what we're asserting then is that we'd like to assert that things get updated. So we're going to assert that after that happens, r equal, and we'd like to just check that we get our 42 in our tip. So first view model dot tip. So our test here, just to run through that again, is we're saying that we're going to arrange that we have this mock tip service, that we're going to set up a real first view model using the mock beneath it. We're going to set its subtotal to 12, and that we're going to check afterwards that we get back our tip. So that might look good to you as a test. It is going to fail, and I'll show you why in a moment. But if we just run this, then you'll see it fails, and it's going to fail in a horrible way. So let's just do this, run unit tests. Okay, so it's failed with a null reference exception, and it's somewhere in the constructor for MvvmCross. So the problem we have here, and as I said, we expected this because we expected to fail, is the first view model inherits from MvvmCross, and MvvmCross knows about MvvmCross, and it kind of expects a few things to be running, and in particular it kind of expects to have an IOC framework running. So in order to get around that, what we can do is we can inherit our first view model tests from a base class that was provided in that NuGet package in this one, in the test helpers that we pulled in. I can't actually see. There it is. The hottuner.tests. This is the one we pulled in, and this test package is, I think it's MVX IOC supporting test. No, I'll have to find out what it is. It's serious.crosscore.mvvmcross.test.core.IOC supporting test. I'm not sure what I got wrong first time when I typed that. So this is the class that we'd like to pull in. Yeah. And once we've done that, then as part of our arrange, we can actually do a base.clearAll. And what that does is that will actually set up the IOC framework for us. And so now if we run this, hopefully we should see, let me go back to the unit test, we should see that that will actually not fail in the same way, because we should now have an IOC framework. So now we're succeeding. Yeah, and we can write other tests here as well. So perhaps we would have a more complicated test. So this might be a test that let's just say this test, or let's just write another test that's the same. So this is going to be the subtotal changes. So this is going to be that if the what's it called, generosity changes, we'd like to check that when the generosity changes, then the tip is recalculated. And again, you might change this, so you might have a 37 here and a 37 there, just to check again that the internal logic of the view model is running. And if we run this up, it should succeed. So that's all very good, and we've got our tests, and we can run all of them at the same time. So we're testing the view model and the service. But there's just one more little category of tests we might want to add, and that's that we might want to check that notifications being sent out as well. So let's just do that, and let's just add here. Test that when tip is recalculated, then we would like to check that a tip notification is sent. So to do that, what we'd do is we'd set up exactly the same kind of thing. So we'll put this to 19. And what we'd like to do is we would like to take the first view model and we would like to subscribe to its property changed. And we would like to add a handler to that property change. So we're just going to do this in line. And we would like to just, find out what happens. So let's just do a var count equals 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to check that if the args is for the tip property, then we will increment count. Yeah, so this is just going to tell us that whenever a property changed is called and the argument is tip, that we will get that. And we could do this, as well. Let's just do this. Let's call this one tip change count, and we could do it for several. So you could have tip change, and you could have the generosity change, and you could also have the subtotal change. And then here you could do this as a switch instead. So switch args.property name, and then we will have obviously a case which is tip, in which case tip change will go, and then we've got the others as well. So let's just do those quickly. Case subtotal, and case generosity. And then what you could do down here is, okay, so whenever generosity changes, we would expect, we don't need to do the R equal here, we don't care about that anymore. What we need to do is we need to test on the tip change count, on the subtotal change count, and on the generosity change count. And what we expect after one change to generosity, we would expect one change to tip, no changes to subtotal, and one change to generosity. So that would be our test. Yeah. And let's just see whether or not this runs. I know for a fact it won't. I know this is going to fail, and that's the whole point of this test, but let's just see it run and see what happens. And what we see when we run this is it fails. And it fails on the very first one. So if you look at the detail here, it tells you that it's failing on, and it'll tell you which line. It'll tell you it's on this one. It tells you it's on line 85, which is this. So it's telling you that tip change hasn't been signaled. And the reason for that is because the raise property changed method, this guy in here, actually internally checks for whether or not, Guy Watson, happy birthday to you. Apologies about these disturbances today. I'll get rid of these notifications, turn them off. But what the raise property changed method does is it checks for the UI thread and it marshals all the calls onto the UI thread. So that's why this is failing and these things aren't being signaled at the moment. So what I'm going to do is we need to work out how to get that UI thread functionality in. And what you have to do for that is, it's a bit fiddly in MvvmCross, but you do have to provide a special mock. So you can't really use the mocking framework. Well, you probably could. But it's generally easier not to use the mocking framework for this, because it's generally easier just to do a custom mock. So for this we call a mock dispatcher, and what you inherit, oops, sorry, I missed the class keyword, mock class mock dispatcher, and what you do is you inherit from a MVX main thread dispatcher, which you have to pull in. ReSharper does that for me. And you also have to provide a IMVX view dispatcher interface on it. So as I say, it's a little bit fiddly, but it's not too bad, and you generally only do this once and then you forget about it, so it's good. So you implement these members, and the one that we really want to use at the moment, so there are three members here. There's one for change presentation, obviously we're not doing that at the moment. There's one for showing a new view model, obviously we're not testing that at the moment. And then there's one for request main action, and that's the one we're actually going to do. And what we're going to do is when we get asked to do something on the main thread, we're just going to do it in line. So let's just do that, and then we'll always just return true. So that's our mock dispatcher. As I say, it's a little bit fiddly, but it was only really 2 lines of code. a couple of lines of include. So we'll put that in its own file, and then we'll register this mock dispatcher. So let's just do that. So in this test that's currently failing, as well as setting up a mock tip service, we're also going to create a var mock dispatcher equals new mock dispatcher, and then we'll register it. So let's just do that. Let's just do it. We've got an IOC that we could register it with, and we'll register it as a singleton, and this is going to be an IMVX view dispatcher. We're going to register. If you want it to be complete, it's probably worth just, particularly if you're going to reuse this code, it's probably also worth putting it as an IMVX main thread dispatcher, as a mock dispatcher. And then once you've done that, this test should now hopefully pass, because it's going to pass through that mock dispatcher. So if we run it, there you go. So, that's a simple way of testing whether or not the property changes are coming out as you expect as well. Perhaps you might also want to test a navigation. So if we were to fake a navigation, let's just add one to our view model. Finally, let's say we also had an iCommand in our view model. iCommand. And let's say this is a pay command. Get return new MVX command. And what we'll do here is when we get asked for payment, when the user presses whatever button they might press on the UI, then what we'll do is we will do a show view model, and let's show a pay view model, which I'll quickly hack up. And what we'll pass in as parameter is we will pass in a new let's just do it using the dictionary method. New dictionary string, and we'll pass in the total, which is going to be let's pass in lots of information. Let's pass in the subtotal, which is going to obviously be hang on, got to remember how to do a dictionary. This is not the hardest thing to do. So we're going to pass in a subtotal, and the subtotal's value is going to be the subtotal to string. And then we'd also like to pass in the tip. In fact, let's just pass in a total. Let's just do it. So what we'll do is we'll take tip plus subtotal dot to string. Obviously, a real business app would do something more clever here. We don't have a pay view model at the moment, so let's just quickly add one. Public class pay view model. That's going to inherit from an MVX view model. And obviously, to make it work, you'd have a public void in it, which would take a double, which would be this total. Just to make that navigation actually work. So we move that to another class. That's done. Perhaps you could have used a navigation object here or whatever, but this is just to quickly demo. So what we then like to do is we'd like to test that this pay command is really working. So let's just do that. So let's go back to our first view model tests, and in here let's add another method, and again it's just going to be a range act assert. Oops, put it in the right place. So this method is going to be test that when test that pay command shows pay view model with correct total. So this might be a bit big as a single test. You might want to try and split this down into multiples. But let's just make sure that's happening. Perhaps you'd also want to put separate tests in here that validate data or whatever else that's going through. So let's just take a look. For this test, we probably don't. No, let's leave our mock tip service in there. That's cool. So we're going to have a mock tip service that returns 19. We're going to have our mock dispatcher because that's still going to be needed. But what we're going to do for our mock dispatcher here is we are going to need this time a show view model handler. So let's just add to this a public, because this is just mock, so we can do what we like with this. Let's just add a public list of MVX show view model requests. Oops. MVX view model requests, and this is going to be the let's just call it requests. Why not? Requests equals, and we'll just make it equal to a new list, and just make that read only so that it never changes. And what we'll do is whenever a show view model comes through, we will do a request.add, and we'll just add the request to the list. Yeah, and obviously then we'll return true. So let's now go back to our first view model tests. We're going to leave our dispatcher in there because we need that for the mocks. We then don't need all this stuff about tip change counts, etc. So let's just get rid of those. And what we'd like to do is we're going to set the generosity to 12, and we'll also set the subtotal equal to 10. And so we know now that our correct total will be 10 plus 19 will be 29. And so then what we want to do is after we, okay, so that's still part of the setup, that's still part of the arrange, all of that. Then the actual action we want to do here is first view model dot, and this is going to be, has it come through? Do I need to rebuild it? Pay command, there it is. So the first view model dot pay command dot execute. No, that's our action. And then after we've done that action, we'd like to check that we've navigated. So to do that, we can go to our mock dispatcher, which was here, and we can assert r equal. And there are things you can do on collections here, etc. But I'm just going to do the simplest. Mock dispatcher dot requests dot count. So we're going to check that there's one request we've had for navigation, and then what I'll do is I'll get that one. So the request was the mock dispatcher dot requests 0, and what I'd like to check is I'd like to check that that request was to a pay view model. So let's just do that. So that's going to be the view model type on this, and so for that all I need to do is that's going to be a type of, and this is going to be a pay view model. And then I'd like to check that the parameter was passed in. So for that what I need to do is I need to look in the request dot, and this is going to be the parameter values, and I think I can just access them like this. So I'm going to, I need to check it's got a total in there. You could do other checks here to make sure there aren't additional parameter values that have somehow snuck in here. And I think what I said was it was going to be 10 plus 29 is what we kind of expected. So this 10 plus 19, so it's going to be 29 is what we actually expected. So let's run this one, see whether or not it runs. And this is called, I didn't mark it with tests, so it's not showing up in my display. So let's add that. And now it should be up here, and we should be able to run it. The build action failed. What did I do wrong? Just see my error list. Okay, so now it's saying that I also need to add system.windows.i command, so let's just do that as well. Let's go to Solution Explorer, references for our test, add references, go to assemblies, type system.windows, it's coming up in the autocomplete for me, and just add it. That's just because we had a console thing there to start with, and we need I command. So hopefully that now builds. Build succeeded. So now we should be able to run this test. And let's see whether or not it ran. Okay, so it's saying that, okay, so all it's saying is that you got 29 as a string, and that's because the parameter values are a dictionary of strings to strings, so that's cool. So it is saying that, your test was incorrect, and it's just because we've got serialized doubles here. So, at this stage we just change that to that, because that is the correct behavior. That's cool. And then you can run it. And so there we go. That is a set of tests for first view model. It's a set of tests for tip service. Obviously, as your application grows, you can build more and more tests. And what it gives you is it gives you a lot of comfort that as you add functionality, as you maintain functionality, as you change functionality, you can go through, this red-green refactor type scenario where you can always make sure that your tests are running and that your application is going to fulfill the business need it needs to. And that's also, it's faster to develop these view models this way than it is to develop them from a real UI, because if you need to hit a pay command, you just hit it. You don't have to go to a simulator and hit a button or whatever. Okay, so that's the basics of testing. Just to go over the list again. Basically, you build your core straightforwardly enough. You can then build an assembly, just a normal .NET Windows class library. You have to add things like NUnit to it. You have to add a mocking framework to it if you want to use one. You then have to use the test package. You can then test things which don't rely on MvvmCross, like your back-end logic, straightforwardly without any kind of custom behavior. If you want to use a view model in your tests, then you will have to inherit or implement your own version for IOC, so you have to inherit from this guy. If you then want to use anything that would be normally marshaled onto the UI thread, you do have to provide a mock dispatcher. And as you add more and more functionality, if you do want to use other MvvmCross features, you would have to mock them as well. But that's the very first basic. I hope that kind of makes sense to people. I hope that wasn't too bad. Sorry about Guy Watson's birthday and my mum's harvester. And yeah, that's the N+1 videos of MvvmCross n=29. As I say, if you want a really good intro, look at Greg's session from Evolve. And that's it. I hope that was useful. Please let me know feedback if there are other things you want me to cover. Cool.